right, folks. Director Akasha Stevenson brings us today's movie, and I've got a big problem with that. Why? I'll fill you in later on. For now, we're going to break the story down into 3 acts so we can determine not only if they've done a good job in terms of storytelling, but also whether or not they've earned the right to refer to themselves as a prequel to one of the greatest horror stories ever made. This is 2024's The First Omen. The movie opens in 1971 with Father Brennan, played by Ralph Ineson from The Witch, and he's meeting secretly in a confessional with Father Harris, played by Alien 3's Charles Dance. Father Brennan's handed a photo of a baby. The name Skiana is written on the back. When Father Brennan comments the child looks so human, he's reminded there's nothing natural about her. The men part with the understanding Father Brennan needs to locate the now teenage girl. And when Father Harris exits the church, we see an homage to the groundbreaking, shocking violence of the original Omen movie when the back of Father Harris's head is split open by a falling pole. We shift to Rome, where American soon-to-be nun Margaret Dano arrives at the Vizzardelli orphanage. Margaret's played by English actress Nell Tiger-Free, and her arrival at the orphanage marks the end of this movie's first act because I couldn't locate a traditional place to call it. In terms of story structure, this opening act was a bit weak. The first act usually comes to an end after they've established the main character's story goal, and that typically happens around the 15 to 20 minute point. When I realized they still hadn't revealed anything by the 30-minute point, I decided to call it at her arrival to the orphanage so things didn't get confused. Now, in terms of horror elements, they did set the tone pretty quickly with that opening scene. I loved the intensity of it. I just wish they could have come up with something brand new instead of replicating a scene from the original film. Now, obviously, the characters haven't given us a lot to go on yet, but I have to compliment this movie on its replication of the 1970s aesthetic. From the physical sets and the costumes to even the color grading, they've managed to keep things clear while maintaining that 70s grainy look. Let's find out how they do in Act 2. Act 2 kicks off with Margaret being greeted and welcomed by Cardinal Lawrence, played by Bill Nye, and Sister Silva, played by Sonia Braga. And then she meets Sister Angelica from the marketing material. She's extra creepy because she appears to have left her eyebrows back in her room this morning. Margaret notices some drawings done by the orphans. While she's appreciating them, she notices one of them is signed Carlita Skiana, and we remember that name from the photo in the intro. When Margaret says hello to young Carlita, she gets her face licked. Back in Margaret's room, we get a subtle hint things are not as they appear when Margaret walks in on her new roommate and fellow nun-to-be, Luz, as she's hoking through some of Margaret's things. They get to talking about how each of them came to be with the church, and for those of you paying attention, you might notice a lot of mirrors in this scene. Mirrors are often used in films to highlight a character's dual nature, and I find it rather telling both Luz and Margaret's reflections are shown in the mirrors in this particular scene. Luz says the voice of God spoke to her when she was 16 after her parents kicked her out of the house. Then Margaret says Cardinal Lawrence was a priest in the orphanage she grew up in. She says she was a problem child with an overly active imagination, and she used to have trouble distinguishing reality from fantasy, but the good cardinal helped her through it. The next night, Luz gets Margaret all skanked up to go out for a boogie. Margaret says she's not comfortable, but Luz convinces her to allow herself one night of fun before she devotes the rest of her days to God. And that seems to do the trick. And they have a lovely time until Margaret blacks out in the company of some random fella named Paulo. And right before she blacks out, she licks his face. And the next day, when Margaret's dealing with her first ever case of the morning after fear, Luz tells her she was mostly well behaved, although she had a tough time pulling her away from her new male friend. And later that day, Father Brennan randomly parks himself next to Margaret and tells her he needs to speak to her urgently about young Carlita, and he leaves her his address. Margaret returns to the orphanage to find out Carlita's been put into isolation for bad behavior. So she takes her aside to talk to her because she sees a lot of her younger self in the girl. And while they're speaking, a ghastly scream comes from inside the building where a young woman is giving birth. Instead of a child emerging, a clawed gray hand does. And Margaret faints. But given she's prone to delusions, we're not sure what actually exited the young mom. And when she's recovered, she finds Carlita and Sister Angelica together talking about this drawing. Carlita says she drew the black bits and Angelica drew in the baby. And when Margaret suggests the drawings are inappropriate, it's Angelica's turn to give Margaret a big smooch. And she does it right before they replicate another scene from 1976's The Omen. Even the dedication is the same. The event is so traumatizing it sends Margaret to Father Brennan's, who warned her terrible things would start happening around Carlita. He tells Margaret radicals within the church are trying to resurrect the Antichrist to create fear and drive people back into the church for its protection. He shows Margaret the photo with a name, and he suggests Carlita is pregnant and she's intended to be the motherly vessel to birth the devil. He tells Margaret to find out the details of Carlita's birth and to check if she bears the 666 mark of the beast. Margaret refuses to believe him, but the following day during a field trip, she sits down with Carlita to ask her delicately if anybody's ever been inappropriate with her. Carlita denies the suggestion, but their conversation goes on to reveal she experiences the same hallucinations Margaret does, and that's why she is so upset all the time. Instantly endeared to the poor young girl, Margaret tries assuring her that what she's seeing isn't really there, but Carlita believes they are really there, and the idea Margaret doesn't believe her upsets her. And then the museum is evacuated due to a violent left-wing riot outside.
Now, just to remind you folks, this movie was set in 1971, and back then they referred to violent riots as violent riots, even if they were started by left-wing extremists.
During the riot, Margaret experiences more of her hallucinations, and Sister Silva sees her having them. So she postpones Margaret's vows ceremony and forbids her from spending any more time with Carlita. On her way home, she spots Paulo, her boy from the other night. When she tries speaking to him, he's reduced to a stuttering, fumbling ball of nerves. He insists he didn't know, and when he's telling her to look for the mark, a truck crushes him against the wall, leaving him half the man he used to be. And this is a variation from another event from the original movie. While roommate Luz is taking her official vows, Margaret goes hoking for Carlita's file to see if she can learn anything about her birth. And what she finds is evidence of a new child being born with the Sciata name every year, all born on June 6 at 6 a.m. When she realizes Father Brennan's right, she tries barricading herself and Carlita into a room, but the nuns are having none of it.
Sorry.
When they tackle everybody to the ground, the girls are pulled apart, and when Carlita screams, Margaret sees 666 on the roof of her mouth. They lock Margaret into a room for the time being, and while she's in there, she hallucinates the burnt version of Sister Angelica. And it's a decent effect, if not a tad predictable, with the requisite screaming used by so many modern horror movies. Then Father Gabriel, who's only briefly interacted with Margaret up until now, comes in with all of the files, and they escape to Father Brennan's. Together, they determine they've been breeding females so the devil can impregnate his own offspring. But when Margaret sees the supposed photo of Carlita as a baby, the 666 mark is on its head and not inside its mouth. Then it dawns on her. Paulo told her to look for the mark. When she finds 666 on her own head, she flashes back to the beast and her own little Rosemary's Baby scene. And that freaks her the fook out. This all means she is pregnant with the Antichrist, and the higher-ups will be wanting her to deliver it at 6 a.m. on June 6, which just happens to be a few hours away. They try and get Margaret somewhere to deal with the pregnancy before it plays out, but they're sideswiped by a car, and everybody's knocked unconscious except for Margaret. The second act comes to a close with Margaret doing a 1980s Talking Heads dance, and the chuds from the church show up right on time to collect her, just as her water's breaking all over the road.
Now, in story terms, it took 50 minutes to find out Father Brennan wanted Margaret to dig up information on Carlita's birth. Now, before that, she was basically wandering around the orphanage watching things happen. Now, there's nothing wrong with the main character exploring their surroundings in the early stages of a story, but without establishing a purpose, it really does start to feel like wandering around. Now, in horror terms, this second act definitely had an air of suspense to it, but it was mostly because we didn't know what was happening. A version of Sister Angelica's fiery leap already happened in the original Omen movie. Now, I'm guessing if you hadn't seen the original Omen movie, that scene might have been shocking to you. The same could be said for this scene when Paulo gets pinned against the wall by the truck. That is a version of a scene from the original movie. And finally, regarding that delivery scene, the practical effects were flawless. The sound effects were very effective. I think they overdid it in terms of how revealing it was, but that's more of a personal preference. And now, speaking of revealing, allow me to reveal the third act. Sorry again.
When Margaret wakes up strapped to a bed, she finds out her old pal Cardinal Lawrence has been behind this whole thing, and he's known it was going to happen her whole life. She delivers 2 children, a boy and a girl, and the boy is hailed as the Antichrist. She asks if she can hold the baby, and for some reason they allow her to. She immediately drives a scalpel into the Cardinal's neck, but she can't bring herself to end the child at the same time. Then Luz, the roommate, throws a knife into Margaret. The ladies run off with the baby boy, and Margaret and her daughter are left to die in a fire. At the last minute, young Carlita comes to the rescue, and as they're escaping, Margaret sees the father of her children through the flames, the Jackal himself, or at least she thinks she does. The film winds down with a voiceover describing the upcoming events of 1976's The Omen. There's even a photo of Gregory Peck. The movie comes to an end with a touch of denouement. A couple of years later, Margaret, Carlita, and the baby girl are an unlikely family, somehow living in a beautiful home in the mountains. Father Brennan shows up to give her a generic warning the church is coming after her, and the screen goes black when he tells her the church named her son Damien, as if that would somehow be surprising to the audience. Overall, I think the first Omen is a bit of a mixed bag. I think Nell Tiger-Free deserves all the praise she's getting for this role. She conveyed the innocence and naivete of a young woman thrust into this bizarre circumstance, and her American accent didn't set off any alarms. Visually, the movie was pleasing on the eye. The architecture and the dusty textures and earthy colors sold the era and the location. Considering how much of the story takes place inside of dark buildings, it never felt dark at any point. If you hadn't seen the original Omen, and you were paying close attention to this movie's plot events, because it can get muddled at times, I could see this being a decent standalone film. For me though, and I'm sure many others like me, if you have seen the original, never mind if you were a fan of it, there are issues, and they're pretty big ones. In this movie, Damien's mother is a nun, but in the source material, Damien's mother was a jackal. Characters Robert Thorne and Keith Jennings go as far as to track it down and show its remains to the audience. This detail is fundamental to the story. In addition, the first Omen's premise is absurd. The idea a handful of higher-ups in the church could intentionally orchestrate the birth of the Antichrist in order to get bums back in the church seats is hilarious. When I heard the explanation coming out of Father Brennan's mouth, I'd have switched the movie off mid-sentence if Ralph Ineson's velvety voice wasn't so bloody hypnotic. This movie did have a handful of decent horror scenes, but they came off feeling like an attempt to replicate the tone of the original film, which is known for its brutality. Despite its positives, the first Omen feels lazy to me. Every great director from Kubrick to Coppola worked their way up and proved themselves worthy before they got anywhere near an actual director's chair. As I said at the start of this review, this is Arkasha's first feature film. I'm not annoyed with her for using the name of one of horror's biggest stories to practice her directing skills, but I do have a problem with the system that makes it possible, because that system is becoming very efficient in cranking out these mediocre movies while we keep having to pay premium prices to watch them.
If you haven't guessed already, I put the original Omen on a very high pedestal. It was full of great performances, the score was iconic, the atmosphere was tense for every single minute of the runtime. It was subtle where it needed to be and absolutely brutal during the death scenes. But most important for today's video, the original Omen had a wildly unique premise, and they wrote an engaging and terrifying story in support of that premise. And that's why it continues to be one of my favorite horror movies all these years later. If you've seen the first Omen already, let me know what you thought of it. If you've also seen the original Omen, let me know if you think I'm being too harsh. As always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, folks. It's me, Jonny, from that video you just loved, and I know you loved it because this book I read told me if I constantly say that to you, you will start to believe it's true. So thanks for loving that video you just watched. You're also going to love this next video as soon as you click on it. Click on it.